Usually when we talk about a diagnostic test, say like in medicine or something, there
Yeah.
is this baseline expectation of just absolute precision.
Right, yeah. Like you want a clear answer.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. There is the problem. It's incredibly straightforward.
Yeah, because it's a binary system, right? The bone is either fractured or it's intact. I mean, your blood pressure is either elevated or it's within a normal range. There's not a lot of ambiguity there.
Right. And there is something deeply, I don't know, comforting about that, isn't there? We like things to be visible. We want them to be neatly categorized so we can just fix them.
Oh, absolutely.
But then you step out of the hospital and you look at the world of global development, of like national trajectories and macroeconomics, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
It really is. Because when you are diagnosing a whole society, the symptoms often contradict each other. A country can be succeeding brilliantly in one vital area while simultaneously failing in another that seems logically connected.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. We are taking a massive stack of United Nations development data, and I mean a really comprehensive look spanning the Human Development Index, the Gender Development Index, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, and planetary pressures data.
It's a lot of data.
It is, and we are looking at all of this alongside a really fascinating presentation that synthesizes the trajectory of one specific nation for you, and that nation is Ethiopia.
Yeah, and we should probably clarify up front that this isn't just, a standard run-of-the-mill country profile.
Definitely not.
Right, we aren't just reading off a ledger here.
Here.
This specific intersection of UN data presents one of the most complex, seemingly impossible development stories in the modern world.
I honestly had to reread the statistics in this presentation a few times because they initially just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, I want to lay out the core tension we're looking at today for you. Imagine a country that ranks near the very bottom of global development indexes.
Like really the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are talking about sitting at 180th out of 193 nations.
Right.
Yet, this exact same country beats the global average in female political representation by nearly 46%.
It's just wild.
It is. And while ranking 180th overall, it has achieved a 98% immunity to planetary climate pressures, right at the exact same moment that the highly developed world is spending trillions of dollars and struggling immensely, by the way, to manage green energy transitions.
Yeah, when you lay it out like that, it really forces us to ask some fundamental questions about what development actually means.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we see those statistics side by side, extreme systemic poverty right alongside world-leading political gender representation and near-zero climate impact, they just break our standard models of how a society is supposed to evolve.
Right, because historically we assume these things move together in a straight line, right? Like as wealth goes up, everything else goes up.
Exactly. And Ethiopia basically proves they don't.
And our mission today isn't to just throw UN statistics at you. The goal is to unpack what we're calling the Ethiopian path. We need to look beneath the surface of that extreme poverty and uncover a story of deep resilience, massive structural contradictions, and several major paradoxes that challenge everything we think we know about how a nation builds itself.
Right.
So let's just start with the most foundational metric we have, which is the speed of their growth versus the reality of their current global ranking.
To do that, we really have to look at the historical timeline of the Human Development Index, or the HDI.
Okay, let's break that down.
So the HDI is the United Nations standard summary measure. It evaluates average achievement in 3 key dimensions of human development. So that's living a long and healthy life, being knowledgeable through education, and having a decent standard of living measured by income.
And it's a scale from 0 to 1, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Calculated a score from 0 to 1.
And the global baseline is really important to establish here. The global HDI climbed quite steadily over the last 30 years. Back in 1990, the world average was a 0.608.
Mm-hmm.
By 2023, it had reached a 0.756. So that is a solid, steady upward curve for humanity as a whole. But then you look at Ethiopia's trajectory, and the starting point is really sobering.
It is.
In the year 2000, Ethiopia's HDI was at roughly 0.293. I mean, 0.293. What does a number that low actually look like on the ground?
Well, a score of 0.293 represents profound systemic deprivation across every single metric of human existence.
Wow.
Yeah, it means the vast majority of the population is living entirely outside the formal economy. It means severe food insecurity, almost non-existent rural infrastructure, and a healthcare system that simply cannot reach the people who need it most.
So it's basically the statistical signature of a society in extreme distress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what happens next is what makes the Ethiopian data so compelling. By 2023, Ethiopia's HDI climbed to nearly zero point 0.5 specifically. It had hit 0.497,
Right, and if you calculate that jump, it represents a growth rate of about 69.6% in just 23 years.
which is massive.
It is. They are growing at a speed that completely outpaces the world's average growth rate. But here is the friction point. Despite that incredible sprint, Ethiopia still languishes at the bottom of the global rankings, sitting at 180th out of 193. It kind of makes you wonder how a country can move so fast and still be at the back of the line.
I mean, think of it like an incredibly powerful locomotive trying to cross a continent.
Okay.
But it was forced to start its journey hundreds of miles behind all the other trains and on tracks that hadn't even been fully laid yet.
Ah, I see.
So the speed of the engine is objectively remarkable.
Huh.
I mean, 69.6% growth in human development is a massive logistical and social achievement. But the starting deficit was so profound that the sheer distance left to cover keeps them at the bottom of the comparative global rankings.
But I really want to dig into how they actually achieved that 70% sprint. Because when a country is starting from that level of poverty, they don't suddenly have a massive influx of Wall Street capital or like a booming tech sector to drive up the index. So where is that growth actually coming from?
That is the exact right question. When you break down the composition of that HDI increase, you find that the crown jewel of this growth isn't economic wealth at all.
It isn't.
No, it's public health. Specifically, it's driven by massive leaps in life expectancy.
Right, the life expectancy numbers in this data stack are just staggering. In 1990, an Ethiopian's life expectancy at birth was 45.1 years. I had to stop and really think about the societal implications of that.
Oh, it changes the entire fabric of a culture.
It has to, right?
Yeah, an average life expectancy of 45 years means a severe lack of elders. It means generational knowledge, agricultural techniques, oral history, community leadership. It isn't being passed down as effectively.
That's devastating.
It is. It means families are constantly, daily, dealing with the trauma of early mortality. And we have to compare that to the global average at the time, which was 65.1 years.
So that is a tragic 20-year gap between an Ethiopian citizen and the average global citizen. 2 decades of human experience of raising grandchildren, of contributing to a community, just erased by circumstance.
Precisely. But let's look at the UN data for 2023. By 2023, Ethiopia's life expectancy soared to 67.3 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and the world average moved up to 73.4. So in roughly 3 decades, Ethiopia shrank that 20-year gap down to just 6.1 years.
That's incredible.
Adding 22 years to a nation's life expectancy in 3 decades is a monumental human achievement.
But how do you actually do that? Because I'm assuming they didn't just build hundreds of world-class multi-million-dollar hospitals across the rural highlands. The money just wasn't there.
No, they absolutely didn't. And this is a crucial lesson in global health. You don't need MRIs and robotic surgery to double a nation's life expectancy from a low baseline. It shows that basic, targeted, highly coordinated health interventions work rapidly. We are talking about grassroots logistical campaigns.
Like what kind of campaigns?
Well, things like distributing millions of insecticide-treated mosquito nets to combat malaria, massive coordinated vaccination drives that reach remote villages, implementing basic sanitation protocols, improving access to clean drinking water, and rudimentary maternal and infant care provided by community health workers.
So it's essentially focusing entirely on preventative, low-cost, high-impact interventions rather than expensive reactive treatment.
Exactly. You can save millions of lives and add decades to a population's lifespan before you ever build a modernized, industrialized economy. You just need the logistical will to distribute the basics.
Okay, so they've successfully added decades to their citizens' lives. They've essentially gained a whole new chapter of adulthood. But it begs the question, what does the quality of those extra years look like? Because being alive is the prerequisite, obviously. But human development is ultimately about what you can do with that life, how you can work, think, and thrive. And that leads us directly into examining their education system and their wealth.
And this is where the data becomes much more sobering. To understand the Ethiopian economy, we have to introduce the concept of stock versus flow in human capital.
I love this concept.
Yeah, it's a brilliant analytical framework to understand the tension between a nation's present reality and its future promise.
Before we get to the education part of that, let's set the baseline with the wealth chasm, just so we know what kind of economic engine is funding this society.
Good idea.
In the UN data, we use gross national income, or GNI, per capita, and it's adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP. Can we just briefly demystify PPP for you guys listening?
Certainly. So PPP essentially means we are adjusting the money to reflect what it actually buys at a local market rather than just doing a straight currency exchange at a bank.
Like a dollar buys a lot more bread in Addis Ababa than it does in New York.
Exactly. So PPP levels the playing field so we can accurately compare the true standard of living.
Got it. So per capita in 2023 was $20,327. Ethiopia's GNI per capita was just $2,796.
Right.
That means the average Ethiopian is subsisting on just 13.7% of the world's average income.
It is an extreme baseline material scarcity. When a country operates on 13.7% of the global average income, every single policy decision is a zero-sum game. If you fund a road, you might not be able to fund a school.
And with that scarce wealth, they have to educate a booming young population. Here's where that stock and flow concept comes in.
Right.
When the data talks about expected years of schooling, we are talking about the flow, the promise being made to the next generation. It's the number of years a child entering the school system today can expect to receive. Ethiopia's expected years of schooling is 9.2 years. For context, the world average is 13.0 years. So 9.2 isn't terrible. It's a solid, systemic commitment to getting kids through primary and into early secondary school.
But then we look at the mean years of schooling.
Right, the reality.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is the stock. This is the reality of the current adult workforce, people aged 25 and older who are currently out there trying to build the economy. And the data shows an incredibly low 2.4 years of mean schooling for adults in Ethiopia.
Wait, 2.4?
Yes, and the world average is 8.7 years.
2.4 years. I want to ground that in reality. That is essentially dropping out in the middle of the third grade. How can a country function, let alone compete globally, with an adult workforce that averages a third-grade education?
It creates a severe developmental bottleneck.
Yeah.
Think of it like trying to build a modern smartphone with a massive team of incredibly hardworking people, but the only tool you've given them is a rudimentary hammer.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
It doesn't matter how hard they work.
Mm-hmm.
The complexity of the task requires advanced tools they simply do not possess. Ethiopia is essentially maxing out its developmental credit right now. They are stretching their meager resources to promise 9.2 years of education to their youth.
The flow.
Right. But the current labor force, the adults who have to generate the tax revenue and the economic output to actually pay for those schools, are operating on an absolute minimum human capital stock of just 2.4 years.
It's a structural trap. You have a country trying to attract international investment, trying to build a 21st century economy, but the average adult might only be able to read basic signs or do fundamental arithmetic.
Exactly.
Advanced vocational skills, digital literacy, complex logistics, operating modern manufacturing equipment, those are just structurally blocked by that lack of early education.
Exactly. This severe lack of human capital handcuffs their current economic productivity. It perfectly explains why the GNI is trapped at $2,796. You cannot build a high-yield manufacturing sector or a complex service economy when the vast majority of your adult workforce lacks formal schooling.
Right, you're just stuck.
They're locked into low-yield, informal, or subsistence agrarian labor. The transition from an agrarian society to an industrial one requires a specific baseline of human capital that the current Ethiopian stock simply does not possess yet.
And when you have such scarce wealth, just 13.7% of the global average, a new question emerges. How does a society distribute it? Because a low average is one thing, but if that tiny amount of wealth is hoarded by a few, the reality for the majority of the population is going to be far worse than the average suggests.
Which brings us to the concept of the inequality penalty.
Right.
The UN has a specific and frankly quite brilliant metric for this, called the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. It essentially acts in the discount rate on a country's development. It asks, if we look at your health, education, and income achievements, how evenly are those distributed across your population?
And obviously, no country on Earth is perfectly equal. Globally, due to internal inequality, the world loses about 22% of its HDI potential. Specifically, the data shows a 21.958% loss rate for the world in 2023.
So humanity is operating at about a fifth below its potential just because of how unevenly resources are spread out.
But in Ethiopia, the loss rate is a staggering 34.4%.
Wow.
Over a third of their human development achievements just evaporate when you account for internal inequality.
How should we visualize that 34.4% loss? Because it's a dry statistic, but it represents millions of people.
Think of a nation's development like a massive engine. The engine generates 100 units of power, that's your raw HDI. But because the internal mechanics are misaligned, that's the inequality. 34.4 units of that power dissipate as friction and heat before they ever reach the wheels.
Ah, I
In
see.
practical terms, it means the raw HDI of 0.497 is a mathematical illusion for a vast segment of the population. You have heavily concentrated pockets of development. If you go to the capital city, Addis Ababa, you will see a modernizing metropolis. There is a light rail system, international investment, universities, and specialized hospitals. It feels like a rapidly emerging market.
But the UN data implies that as soon as you leave the capital, that reality drops off completely. It falls off a cliff. When you step outside into the vast rural agrarian highlands or the pastoral regions, the access to that infrastructure vanishes. The wealth, the 9.2 years of expected schooling, the modern clinics, they're heavily concentrated geographically and socioeconomically.
And I imagine that macroeconomic friction is devastating. If 34.4% of your developmental potential doesn't reach the average citizen, you have vast swaths of your population who cannot participate in the economy. They can't buy consumer goods, they can't innovate, they aren't healthy enough to labor efficiently. They are basically siloed away from the nation's growth engine.
Precisely. We often treat inequality as primarily a social grievance, a matter of moral fairness. But from a structural perspective, inequality of this magnitude is a literal development killer.
Now, here's where the data took a turn that genuinely surprised me. As society is under extreme economic stress and resources are this scarce and this unequally distributed, historical precedent tells us to expect massive disparities in gender rights.
Usually, yes.
Usually, when a system is starved of resources, marginalized groups, particularly women, are pushed entirely out of power structures. But the UN data here shows something completely contradictory.
It is an anomaly that challenges traditional development theory entirely. Looking closely at these data sets, Ethiopia presents one of the most structurally fascinating political realities on the globe right now regarding gender.
Okay, let's start with the baseline gender data so we have the full picture. According to the Gender Development Index, or GDI, Ethiopia is in Group 5.
Right.
And just to contextualize Group 5, that essentially means a society with severe systemic gaps between men and women across health, knowledge, and living standards. The GDI value is 0.886, and the income gap is very stark. The female gross national income per capita is $2,056, while the male GNI is $3,531. So men are earning significantly more in a system that is already deeply impoverished.
And up to this point, the data aligns perfectly with what traditional development models would predict. A poor, highly unequal country displays deep economic gender disparities. But then we pivot to the political data and the model breaks.
The political shock. This is the statistic that completely defies the narrative. The global average for female seats in parliament, meaning the share of national political decision-making power held by women across the entire world, is 26.54%.
Right.
Ethiopia stands at an astounding 38.8%. Specifically, the 2023 data logs it at 38.799%.
Let that sink in. A country ranking 180th in overall human development, a country with an adult workforce averaging 2.4 years of education, beats the global average in female political representation by nearly 46%.
It's unbelievable.
They have leapfrogged deeply industrialized, wealthy Western nations in achieving gender parity at the highest levels of national government.
But I have to push back here. Is this real legislative power? When I see a number spike that aggressively in a developing nation, my immediate thought is, how did they do it?
That's a fair question.
Because looking at the historical data in our stack, this wasn't a slow, century-long cultural evolution. In 2004, female representation in Ethiopia's parliament was a mere 7.7%. Just a year later, in 2005, it jumped to 20.9%. By 2015, it hit 37.2%. You don't get a 30% jump in a decade organically. Is this just political window dressing, like a top-down mandate to make international donors happy, or are these women actually wielding power?
It is a vital distinction to make. To understand this, we have to look neutrally at the mechanics of state building. And just to be clear, we are just reporting on the structural reality here, not endorsing a specific political ideology.
Right, purely looking at the data.
You are correct. This was not an organic, grassroots, sociological shift. It was a deliberate, top-down structural mandate implemented by the ruling political coalition at the time. They instituted specific internal quotas and political mechanisms essentially mandating that a certain percentage of candidates put forward for election had to be women.
So the state apparatus simply decided it was going to happen and engineered the electoral system to guarantee the outcome.
Exactly. Now, whether that translates to immediate, decentralized grassroots empowerment is a highly debated topic in political science.
Yeah.
But viewing this purely as a structural reality of the UN data, it proves a fascinating point. Political representation can be engineered rapidly if the state decides it is a priority, regardless of the underlying economic conditions. You do not have to wait for your GNI to hit $20,000 before you put women in parliament.
And we see another anomaly in the labor force. The female labor force participation rate in Ethiopia is 55.6%.
Hmm.
The world average is only 46.5%. So Ethiopian women are working in the economy at much higher rates than the global average, and they're sitting in parliament at much higher rates.
Yeah.
If you isolated just those two statistics, you might assume you were looking at a wealthy Scandinavian social democracy.
But we absolutely must contextualize that labor participation because the motivation for working matters deeply. High female labor force participation is not always a sign of corporate empowerment or feminist liberation in the way it might be framed in wealthy post-industrial nations. In Ethiopia, it is heavily driven by severe survival pressure.
Right, because when the male GNI is only $3,500 and the female GNI is $2,000, a single-income household is a mathematical impossibility for survival.
Precisely. Everyone must work.
Hmm.
Women are participating in the labor force at 55.6% because the economic reality demands physical labor from every capable adult just to secure basic caloric needs and shelter. It is labor born of necessity, not necessarily of opportunity.
Which brings us to the brutal reality of this specific paradox. It's a dynamic we can call politics versus survival. Because while there are women making laws in the capital, the daily survival metrics for women on the ground in the rural villages are harrowing. Let's look at the maternal mortality ratio, the MMR.
This is a tough one.
It is. The world average is 216 deaths per 100,000 live births. Ethiopia's MMR is 267. And the adolescent birth rate, the number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. The global average is 39.1. In Ethiopia, it is 69.9.
This is the ultimate friction point of the Ethiopian path. Top-down political mandates have successfully placed women in seats of power. That is an undeniable statistical fact. But that centralized political power has not yet trickled down to fix the broken plumbing of grassroots healthcare.
It seems like it's a matter of logistics. You can mandate a parliamentary seat overnight with a stroke of a pen. You cannot mandate a fully staffed, sterile rural clinic into existence overnight.
Exactly. Building a clinic requires complex physical supply chains. It requires trained nurses, reliable cold storage for medicines like oxytocin to stop postpartum hemorrhaging, paved roads to transport pregnant women in distress, and a stable electricity grid.
It's like installing a state-of-the-art, voice-activated GPS system in a car that has no tires and a cracked engine block.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The high-level technology, the political representation is functioning flawlessly. But the foundational mechanics required to actually move the vehicle forward, basic maternal health and teenage pregnancy prevention, are still crumbling under the weight of extreme poverty.
The penthouse is pristine, but the structural columns holding it up are compromised. And to really understand why that foundation is crumbling, why a rural clinic is so incredibly hard to build and staff, we have to stop looking at poverty merely as a lack of money.
Right.
We need to look at the physical reality of daily life. We need to talk about multidimensional poverty.
Yes, because when we hear the word poverty, our minds immediately go to a dollar amount. We think of the classic World Bank metric, like living on less than $1.90 a day. But the UN data stack gives us the multidimensional poverty index, or MPI, and this metric is a game changer because it measures the physical reality of deprivation. The 2019 Demographic and Health Survey for Ethiopia shows an MPI headcount of 68.7%.
To translate that, nearly 7 out of 10 Ethiopians live in multidimensional deprivation. It's not just that their bank accounts are empty. Their physical environment is fundamentally lacking the structural necessities of modern human existence. The MPI intensity metric, which measures how severe that deprivation is for the individuals experiencing it, is 53.3%.
So what actually makes up this multidimensional poverty? The data breaks down the exact drivers, and this is where the reality of the situation really hits you. The biggest contributor to their poverty isn't a lack of income.
No, it's not.
The top drivers are structural. Years of schooling contributes 17.4% to the poverty metric. School attendance contributes 14.1%. Nutrition contributes 12.2%. And then there is an incredibly specific metric, A lack of cooking fuel contributes 10.3%.
Think about the implications of that. If we connect this to the macroeconomic picture, this data proves why simply handing an Ethiopian family cash doesn't solve the underlying crisis.
Because there's nothing to buy.
Well, partially. If you give a rural family a basic income stimulus, it doesn't magically manifest a local school for their children. It doesn't put a trained, salaried teacher in that empty room. It doesn't pave the muddy road required to get the child to the school during the rainy season. And it certainly doesn't install a clean-burning electric stove in their kitchen.
Let's focus on that cooking fuel metric for a second, because I found that fascinating. If over 10% of your nation's poverty metric is driven literally by not having safe cooking fuel, your daily life is fundamentally structured around survival foraging. It means a significant portion of your day, and historically, this burden falls almost entirely on women and children, is spent walking miles to gather wood, crop residue, or animal dung.
It creates massive time poverty. If a young girl is walking 4 hours a day to gather firewood, she cannot be in school. That directly impacts the school attendance metric, which directly impacts the 2.4 years of adult education stock we talked about earlier. Everything is interlinked.
Wow.
Furthermore, there is a devastating health tax. They bring that gathered biomass into a poorly ventilated home, light it on fire, and the family breathes in toxic smoke just to boil water or cook a basic meal. The respiratory diseases caused by indoor air pollution are a silent epidemic in the developing world.
So multidimensional poverty shows us that poverty isn't an empty wallet. It's an interlocking web of missing infrastructure. Escaping it requires massive physical, structural development. You need concrete, you need steel, you need power grids, you need complex supply chains. You cannot just adjust a monetary policy or a currency peg. You have to physically build the modern world from the dirt up.
Which logically requires a massive expenditure of energy and resources.
And that bizarrely transitions us right into our final and perhaps most mind-bending data point. Because that extreme lack of modern infrastructure, that reliance on gathering wood instead of plugging in a microwave, creates a statistical illusion when we look at their climate data. Let's look at the ecological footprint of this poverty.
To do this, we use a relatively new metric, which is the PHDI, or the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
Okay.
The UN created this metric to answer a vital 21st century question. How much environmental damage is a country doing to achieve its level of human development? It takes the standard HDI and adjusts it by penalizing a nation for its carbon dioxide emissions and its material footprint.
And again, just to be objective, we're just reporting the data structures here, not taking a stance on global climate policies. But the results of that adjustment are a massive wake-up call for the developed world. When you adjust the world's average HDI for carbon emissions and material footprint, the world's overall development score drops by 10.05%.
Right.
Basically, humanity is taking a 10% penalty on its development because we are actively destroying the biosphere to achieve it.
But then you look at Ethiopia. When you adjust Ethiopia's HDI for planetary pressures, their score only drops by 2.01%.
2%.
Yeah, they effectively have a 98% planetary pressure immunity.
Right.
The environmental penalty they pay for their development is mathematically negligible compared to the global north.
And the raw data proves exactly why. Ethiopia's per capita CO2 emissions are 0.12 tons. Let me repeat that, 0.12 tons per person per year.
It's incredibly low.
The world average is 4.5 tons, and their material footprint, which measures the sheer weight of raw materials, the fossil fuels, the ores, the concrete, extracted to meet their consumption demands, is 3.46 tons per person. The world average is 12.7 tons.
But we have to be fiercely objective in how we contextualize this. In some international development discourses, metrics like this are sometimes framed as an alternative leadership in green sustainability, but we cannot romanticize this.
Right.
This 98% immunity is a passive result of severe material deprivation. It is not an active, policy-driven choice of utilizing advanced, expensive green technology.
Right. It's like praising someone for having a perfectly low-calorie diet when the reality is they're actually starving.
Yes, exactly.
They are low carbon because, as we saw in the multidimensional poverty data, they consume almost nothing. They don't have personal vehicles, they don't have air conditioning grids, they aren't consuming mass manufactured plastics, they are cooking with gathered branches and dung.
Exactly. Their ecological footprint is small because their economic footprint is small. And this outlines the central tension of the 21st century for the developing world. The massive, unprecedented challenge Ethiopia faces is how to increase their material consumption, how to physically build the schools, the hospitals, the paved roads, and the power grids necessary to escape that 68.7% multidimensional poverty rate without falling into the destructive high-carbon trajectories that the West used to develop over the last 2 centuries.
They essentially have to leap over the fossil fuel heavy industrial age entirely. They have to go from gathering biomass straight to solar microgrids and geothermal power without the intermediary step of building a massive coal-powered economy.
And doing so requires capital, technology transfers, and human capital. That 2.4 years of education stock we discussed that they do not currently possess in sufficient quantities.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this entire deep dive, what we've been calling the Ethiopian path. When you stack all this UN data together, the rapid HDI climb, the expected versus mean education gap, the 34% inequality penalty, the massive political gender quota success paired with high maternal mortality, and finally, the multidimensional poverty driving a mathematically perfect green footprint, you realize that Ethiopia is not merely a laggard dragging its feet at the bottom of the global ranking.
No, it is actively writing a script for a totally new kind of leapfrog development.
Yeah.
They are a living, breathing laboratory of macroeconomic extremes.
They have leapfrogged the world in political gender representation, hitting nearly 39% female parliamentary seats while remaining in the lowest global income brackets. They exist in a state of low-carbon survival, taking only a 2% penalty on their planetary pressures, while the heavily industrialized world suffocates on its own exhaust. But they are simultaneously crippled by internal inequality and a workforce trying to compete globally with a third-grade education level.
The true test of the Ethiopian path, and what economists will be watching for the next few decades, is whether they can close these paradoxical gaps.
Yeah.
Can they find a way to translate that top-down political power in the parliament into well-stocked, grassroots maternal health clinics? Can they turn that promise of 9.2 years of expected education into actual productive human capital that can build a modern economy?
Yeah.
And most dauntingly, can they gain the wealth necessary to wipe out that multidimensional poverty, but do it without losing their planetary immunity?
It is a tightrope walk of epic proportions, and it leaves me with a lingering thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this analysis. Throughout this deep dive, we've implicitly framed the baseline question as how can developing nations like Ethiopia catch up to the wealth and stability of the developed world? But looking at that 2% planetary pressure penalty, looking at how they exist without destroying the biosphere, perhaps the real question is flipped. Can the wealthy, heavily developed world learn to reverse engineer Ethiopia's ecological footprint without forcing people back into multidimensional poverty? Can we meet somewhere in the middle?
That may very well be the defining question of our era. Finding the elusive space between 12.7 tons of material consumption and 3.46 tons, where human dignity, modern comfort, and planetary survival can finally coexist.
Thank you for taking this deep dive into the data with us. Remember that broken X-ray machine we talked about at the start. The picture of global development is never binary, it is never perfectly clean, it is murky, it is heavily paradoxical, and as the data from Ethiopia shows us today, it is profoundly human. Stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next one.